Where did you grow up?
Okay, I grew up in Belfast, South Belfast, which is 2 or 3 miles from where we're sitting today. Reasonably mixed community, Rory, by and large, until the chaos began in this space in the late 60s. Neighbourhood probably mostly Protestant Unionists, but the street I lived in with probably 6 to 8 Catholic families. But gradually, over a period of time, on both sides of this political divide, we became more and more segregated. So I have vague memories of that as a little boy, sort of growing up in the 60s.
How did you get involved in ministry and working
Yeah.
with church?
Initially, I worked in the health service, sort of hospital administration, and sort of embraced Christian faith probably in my mid-20s, and then trained at Queen's. And I suppose from sort of 92 there to 99, which really when conflict was at a pretty messy level in the early 90s. And I was stationed not too far. I use the word station because it's a traditional Methodist term. You are stationed in certain churches. So I had 2 churches then. One was Sandy Row Methodist, staunchly loyalist area, and the other one was up on Workman Avenue, which is on the Springfield Road. It's a very contentious space because of parades, and the 2 communities literally buffer on to one another. And so in 92, myself actually, and a Catholic Dominican sister, Noreen Christian, who'd actually spent 25 years in South Africa in the struggle against apartheid, we began to ask questions: how do we get people who are literally neighbours to begin to talk about the difficult topics? So over a period of sort of 7-8 years, we put together a project called Forspring. So the river that ran through the neighbourhood was called the Forth River, and the road was the Springfield Road. We literally ended up slicing that Methodist church in half and developed a community centre. But we also bought several houses on the Protestant side of the interface or the political divide. And Noreen was able to live there as a Catholic Dominican sister because people on both sides believed what we were doing. Now, some of the stories out of that are interesting. We eventually, I think, got a grant of $1.5 million and developed this space. But I remember the day it was opened, I remember giving Noreen Christian, the Catholic Dominican sister, a set of keys. And somebody in my church came to me and says, in a very strong Belfast accent, "Gary, what are you doing?" And I said, "Just giving Noreen keys." Why? And I kind of analysed it, Rory, over the next few days and said, keys symbolise ownership in a contested space. So it meant for the first time in the history of that Protestant Methodist church that the other was able to put the key into the community centre's door or into the church door. So even simple things like that, because people in a space, and that's gone back, that lady now is dead, but her memory was probably gone back to the late 60s and early 70s when we kind of cleared our neighbourhoods of the other, and for her, one of the other was now able to open her church door. So even a very simple gesture like that was pregnant with meaning in this very sectarian space.
A story you told me about a couple of friends where, would you mind sharing that?
Yeah.
It's like how just, different journeys.
Yeah. I mean, people have often asked me the question, both in the US here and I guess in the Middle East, those 3 sort of regions I work in, they've often said, "Gary, you never ended up in political violence, and yet many people did." And I often tell the story really of 3 boys, just ordinary kids, could have grown up anywhere on planet Earth. They grew up in what was primarily, I suppose, then a unionist Protestant, a British neighbourhood as such. 2 of those boys went to Sunday school together, sort of 3 to 4 p.m. They went and were taught the Christian faith in Sunday school. Another 2 of those boys overlapped in going to primary school together, which is age 4 to age 11 in our sort of Irish-British context. One of those boys is now dead. He was shot in the back during an internal paramilitary feud in the early 1980s. The other boy served 18 years for murder in prison, and I'm the 3rd boy that ends up a Methodist clergy person. And it's interesting, when I tell that story, people try to spiritualise it, particularly in churches. They often say, Gary, God's hand was on you. Like as if there was these other 2 boys were, monsters. The irony is, and I say this in a Christian framework, what they did was wrong. But the bigger question, I think, for any space on planet Earth is, what made 2 kids at 16 and 17 years of age, do what they did. As a friend of mine who's long dead was involved in loyalism said, in the late 1960s, someone did not fly over the north of Ireland or Northern Ireland, spray us all with lunatic gas, and we all woke up and said, let's start killing each other. So I would argue there was a context here of what I would call toxic religion and toxic politics that really demonise the other person. And I mean, to quote somebody from the United States who walked in the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King Jr., Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a Jewish rabbi, he said, dehumanization precedes genocide. But he also said it was words, not machines, that created Auschwitz. So long before the death camps existed, there were thousands of years, sadly, religious anti-Semitism, I would argue strongly, prepared the way for the Holocaust. But it was the same here. I mean, we had fundamentalist preachers here who were demonising the other side. Prior, I suppose, in 1965, in the Catholic Church, people from my side of the fence were classed as heretics. We're now just separated brethren. So it was never a religious war in this space. But I would argue that religion has the ability to demonise the other. I mean, one French historian, Jules Isaacs, calls it the teaching of contempt. And both Protestants in this space and Catholics in this space had the ability to talk about the other as being contemptible because their theological persuasion was undoubtedly superior to the other person's theological persuasion. But it was never a religious war. I mean, it was primarily, I often say when there's conflict there, it's about land, identity, and religion. And all those components were very active here. Is this British land? Is it Irish land? Am I British? Am I Irish? Am I both? So all those components were spilling. And interestingly, I mean, I visit the US quite a bit. I remember way back in 2014, a colleague in Union Theological Seminary, which is an Upper West Side there in Manhattan, wrote an article talking about the United States where he said, no one in the United States wants to talk about the legacy of slavery. I remember responding to that and saying, there's a really interesting S word. Let me tell you about my S word. It's called sectarianism. And I said, and I grew up in a space as a little boy, 60s into the 70s, where we hadn't the ability, both politically and theologically, to actually deal with religious sectarianism, and we ended up spilling into a civil war. Interesting, when I wrote the response in 2014, I remember saying in the blog or the article, I am not suggesting that America is moving towards a civil war. I couldn't say that today in 2023. Because the climate in the United States, and to quote another Jewish theologian, he uses this phrase, linguistic violence. As I look at the US at the moment, and I look at the linguistic violence, the verbal assassination of Republicans and Democrats of the other. And interestingly, prior to the last election, or the sort of Trump-Biden election, both Liberals and Conservatives were saying, we need to be careful or we could end up spilling into a civil war. And I mean, the memory of the Civil War in America is still alive and well. The story I tell about that, I was in Atlanta a number of years ago. I was visiting professorship at Emory University in Atlanta, and a friend of mine took me to the cyclorama, which is this 360, you sit in this carousel and you go around and it shows you Sherman's burning of Atlanta. And I walked out with my friend, who will be nameless, highly educated, from the deep south, and he turns to me and he says, Gary, isn't it awful what those damn Yankees did to our city? And I remember saying his name, which I will not say on camera, and I said, how long ago was that? Like 1860s? And I say, you're worried about us cursed Irish who are obsessed with dates like 1641 and 1690 and 1798? And you just see, I think, Rory, how we pass history down from generation to generation and how it toxifies the environment and the atmosphere.
Can you explain what it means to act as a persuader to those who were pursuing political violence?
Yeah. Kind of late 80s, I was the sort of youngest, I no longer am. A number of clergy persons began to talk to both those on the loyalist side and the Republican side. Those who were pursuing, people call it terrorism, paramilitarism, political violence, whatever phrase people want to use. And I suppose the kind of mantra I had, and I still remember it, And it kind of goes like this. If you lock 40 men in a room, I say this, the detriment of my own gender, mind you, listening to their own reassuring voices, it's a recipe for disaster. And I think both within republicanism and loyalism, that the phrase we use now is an echo chamber, it's a more fancy phrase, that people were listening to their own narratives. And I just felt, particularly those who were clergy, I mean, I'm talking about Catholic clergy and Protestant clergy, were trying to create, I suppose what I call a moral framework to say there is another way to do this. And I mean, that took, a number of years. And I suppose eventually then we led the Downing Street Declaration and we led the ceasefires in 1994. We ended up to a ceasefire breaking down in 96, and eventually we moved towards the Good Friday Agreement. I suppose I would argue as well, we need politicians in the mix. But we can't let politicians dominate this space. And I say that to folk in the US as well. When I'm often in the US, I'm arguing that academics, women's groups, religious actors need to be shaping the public space. We call it here, a colleague of mine at Queen's, who's a brilliant sociologist, talks about the political peace process versus the social peace process. So the social peace process is said it is women's groups, it's men's groups, it's cultural groups, it's art groups, who make up society, because not every person in society is a politician. So that social peace process, I've often said, is one of the key lessons from the Irish peace process. I think for any zone in conflict at the moment, we need to make sure that people from civic society have a voice at the table. And that's been one of the most important things, I think, out of our peace process.
Did you face any backlash from your community for engaging in the other?
Yeah, the classic story I tell, going back to Workman Avenue, which again is just a mile from where we're sitting, there was a miserable, typical, stinking, rotten, wet Irish night, and I was parked my car on the Protestant side of the fence, and then I had to go out into the Catholic neighbourhood because the entrance to the church was in the Catholic neighbourhood, and I was parked a car, and this 16-year-old kid shouts to me, "Hey Gary!" I says, yeah, what is it? He says, "Can I tell you a secret?" I says, "Yeah, go ahead." He says, "Yeah, it is a real secret." I said, "That's okay, tell me your secret." He says, "I'm dating a Catholic boy from the other side." It's almost like a confession, in a sense, like a kind of sacramental confession. I said, "That's great. I hope it's a great time for you." And I walked through the interface and I said to myself, isn't it awful that sectarianism, or racism, or anti-Semitism, or Islamophobia destroys the most basic human emotion that all of us have, called love? So all of us, all viewers listening to this conversation have been in love. But that's how dangerous racism, sectarianism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia is. It destroys the most powerful human emotion on planet Earth. Don't dare date the person of the other skin colour, or the person of a different religion, or the person who lives in a different neighbourhood. And in many ways, sadly, that's what our sectarianism did in this space for centuries. The other one I remember is a young Catholic girl, 16-year-old kid, just lived facing this Springfield Road Methodist Church, which evolved into Four Spring Community Centre, and somebody from sort of the Protestant side, my side of the fence, had wheeled a brick through this kid's window. She'd given birth as a young teenager, 16, 17, and like the rock missed her kid's head by inches. And I remember going across, crossing over the divide and ringing this little girl's doorbell, and her coming out. And I deliberately put my clerical collar on, and I said to her, "Look, I'm the minister of that church over there. I just want to say sorry. Whoever did that was fundamentally wrong, and I want to apologise." Now, who did I get at the neck from? My own side, because they were saying, "What the hell are you apologising to them for? They're throwing rocks at us." And I said, "Well, actually, my job as a religious leader is to stop both sides throwing rocks." But we have that ability, as I say, there are sociologists call it othering, or dehumanising the other person. And I think both religious actors and civic society needs to step into that space, and we need to learn to humanise each other.
Can you explain the politics of healing?
Yeah. I think sometimes, and I'm not persuading every person listening to this to grab religion, that's a personal choice. But I think sometimes we treat those the Bible as we call it, the Holy Bible as we call it, we treat it as those texts were written by someone sitting on a cloud, like playing a harp. I mean, they were written in very violent situations. And I kind of look at the book of Isaiah as a classic example. And for me, it is a book of the politics of healing, because it starts with a critique of an unjust society, and it eventually moves towards a new beginning. So I think any religious actor working in conflict, in fact any sane person, needs to have the integrity to call out racism, sectarianism, linguistic violence, be that in the Middle East, be it in the States, be it in South Africa, be it in the Irish-British context, to actually call that out. And I mean, people say the Bible's not political. Like, really? So in the classic story there, I did one of those Theo TED talks recently in Atlanta, and I actually did it in a Good Samaritan. And I said, think of what was being said there. So a young lawyer comes to Jesus and asks a question that all of us know: who is my neighbour? Now, the last thing he wanted to hear was your neighbour is a Samaritan. A Samaritan? Samaritans are heretics. At that stage, those within Judaism devalued Samaritans. So what that person, like all of us, wanted to hear: oh, your neighbour is just like you. Wears the same suit, same skin colour, same theology, same politics. So here's the Son of God says, oh no, your neighbour is a Samaritan. And it was interestingly, in those kind of ancient texts there in the first century, it says, the lawyer asked Jesus a question to test him or tempt him. And I often look at American churches, I look at British Irish churches, I look at the Middle East, I look at South Africa, where we've done a little bit of work. We spend our time testing each other or tempting each other. And the other key word in that text is, it says, the young lawyer sought to justify himself. Look at American politics today, both politically and religiously. Look at this space for decades. I am sick, sore and tired listening to people trying to justify their position and not be willing to listen to the other person's position. And that's why I think a lot of my work has been creating spaces for those who are involved in political violence, to hear each other and to humanise each other, and to ask the question. I mean, a very courageous former IRA figure, Republican, who I will not name, said if I had been born 100 metres away, I would have been in the Ulster Volunteer Force, which was the organisation he eventually wanted to kill people in, and those in the Ulster Volunteer Force wanted to kill him. That's a very courageous statement. I suppose in the Middle East, that would be a bit like saying, if you're in the IDF, if I'd have been born in Ramallah, I would have been in the PLO. If born in Gaza City, I would have been born in Hamas. But it also means somebody in Hamas or somebody in the PLO saying, if I'd have born in Tel Aviv, I would have been in the IDF. So accidents of birth shape your narrative. I mean, the story I often tell her as well, growing up in my Protestant Unionist tradition, my grandmother insisted every 12th of July I went to see the Protestant Orange Men walking up the Lisburn Road. And I remember as a little boy, just 6 years of age, looking at this banner that kind of scared me as a child. And the banner was Protestants in a River. In 1641, when there's a rebellion here, Ireland is peppered with rebellions every 25 years. It's the nature of the beast in this space. And the Catholics were pushing the Protestants down onto the water to drown them. I'm 6. So my narrative becomes, as a child, see, Catholics, you can't trust them to drown Protestants. But only as I grew up, I realised there was another little boy. And 3 or 4 weeks later, after the 12th of July, the Catholic Ancient Order of Hibernians, which is a Catholic organisation, he was seeing his banners, which showed Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector, racing through Southern Ireland and his troops ramming spears through the chests of Catholics. So this 6-year-old Catholic boy's narrative is, those Protestants, you couldn't trust them, they stick spears to the chest of Catholics. And the irony of this divided space is, me at 6 and this kid at 6, we never met to hear each other's narratives. It was only in later life we began to understand, look, humanise, and have the grace then to say, we all got a lot of things wrong. A story I remembered again, names will be nameless. I had a group of Israelis and Palestinians here, 2014, 2015, and a very, very senior unionist figure, who will be nameless, and a very senior Sinn Féin figure, who will also be nameless. And the Republican Sinn Féin person said, we've inflicted a lot of pain on the unionist community as Republicans. The person as a senior unionist said, I remember during the conflict, a young IRA volunteer was shot dead by the security forces. I think he was 17 or 18, and I did ask myself the question, could that kid's life have been different? And I actually wanted to write to his parents, but I couldn't. So I said to them, guys, tell me this. Would you go like on a kind of documentary or a talk show and say that? Oh no, we couldn't say that outside this room, Gary, because our own constituency wouldn't want to hear it. But real leadership of those two people should have been, yeah, we can. Because then that would allow other people in their respective constituencies to be able to have the same conversations. So I think for those who are peace builders or involved in conflict transformation, it's what I call, how do you take thoughtful, strategic risks in the public space to change the narrative? But that takes courage.
Northern Ireland is such a small place. Can you talk about the number of people impacted in many ways, death, imprisonment, bombings during the conflict, and compare that to the numbers for an American audience?
Yeah. I mean, Northern Ireland, normally people on that British Unionist side say Northern Ireland, those on the Nationalist Republican side call it the North of Ireland. Not dissimilar to the United States when you talk about the War of Northern Aggression or the Civil War. So you're not that dissimilar to us as regards what titles you pick to talk about these things. I mean, during the conflict, like 1.5, 1.6 million people lived in this space. It's almost at 2 million now, 1.9 million. But over that period, we had 47,000 injuries. We had 36,000 shootings. With 30,000 people went through our penal system, and with 16,000 bombings and 22,000 armed robberies. I often extrapolate those figures, particularly for colleagues and friends in the United States. So very simply put, if the Northern Irish conflict had have happened in the United States over a 30-year period, you would have had 9 million injuries, 7 million shootings, 6 million political prisoners, 4 million armed robberies, and 3 million bombings. So people often ask, I mean, the Good Friday Agreement which was a momentous event, chaired interestingly by an American Democratic Senator, Senator George Mitchell. But the day that was signed, April the 10th, so 25th anniversary is on the horizon, George Mitchell, almost throwaway comment, says, if you think getting this agreement was difficult, and it was, implementing it will be even more difficult. And one of the reasons for that is memory, how we deal with memory. I mean, within the United States, people have still memories of many things that happened many, many years ago. So how do we create a process then that allows us to do memory well? On the streets of Belfast, as I walk about them with different groups from the United States and the Middle East, I wrote an article, I remember, for an English newspaper a few years ago where I said, as I drive the 1.2 miles to my office every day, the past screams at me from every gable wall. There really needs to be a conversation in my space. How do we deal with the past? But here we are 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement. We still have not got the architecture for dealing with the past. So those kind of two haunted houses, an Irish tradition of nationalism and unionism, we need to deal with the ghosts of the past. And that's a difficult projected journey as well.
Can you talk about some of the causes of Brexit, and has Brexit changed any of the conversations here?
Yeah. Well, cards on the table as regards Brexit. I was a convinced Remainer. One of the key concepts of the Good Friday Agreement was blurring identity. As I said, when there's conflict, three issues: land, identity and religion. This land is my land, not your land. My identity is superior to your identity, and toxic religion, or what I call it, theologies of superiority, feed into that as well. The Good Friday Agreement blurred identity. You want to be British? Fine. Irish? Fine. European? Fine. You want to be British and Irish and European? That's fine. Brexit, to me, no matter what the proponents of Brexit say, was about identity. It was about British identity. More accurately, it was about English nationalism. It was also about those others coming in to my space. To me, it's been an absolute disaster. I mean, the Good Friday Agreement, while it wasn't perfect, it actually blurred identity in a way that people, assuming I have a British, Irish passport, I see myself as European. I don't want to limit myself to one single space because I've been influenced by British culture, Irish culture and European culture. For the Northern nationalist, those from the Catholic nationalist tradition, One of the reasons they bought into the Good Friday Agreement was it recognised their Irishness. Brexit trailed that carpet out from under them. So even the most liberal, moderate nationalist friend of mine are really angry at what happened over Brexit. So in reality, it's pressed the fast forward button on the debate towards a new Ireland or an agreed Ireland. That's what it has done. The thing that I struggle with Brexit is no one has put their hands up yet and said, I got this wrong. I mean, it's almost, the Conservatives are still covering it up. It's going to be a great success. Somebody recently said it'll work in about 50 years. Well, you know what? Even my kids who are in their 30s may not be around in 50 years. So to me, it was about identity, about English nationalism. And for me, it was a disaster. And I think more and more people are coming to see that. And I think as well, it was the deception politically around it. I mean, things were said by politicians that were just outright lies. And yet people bought into this. I often say it's a great, for your viewers, maybe after they watch this, if you have nothing to do, watch a TED talk called The Danger of the Single Narrative. I'm always cautious when somebody says there's one narrative. There's a multiplicity of narratives in Ireland, in the United States, in the Middle East, and in South Africa. That's human nature.
What has been the response in this community to Brexit? Has it alienated people, angered people?
Yeah. Within the Protestant community, because of the debate around the border, many people within that unionist community has seen it as lessening their British identity. I don't necessarily buy into that argument, and I've had a number of conversations with people from my own tradition about that. I mean, I think Brexit as regards the border, etc., was primarily to do with economics, but many people see it as a very constitutional issue. I mean, I understand that. The only way it's going to be resolved is how this conflict was resolved, through compromise. I mean, Mitchell had the ability to create a win-win situation for both sides, where unionists felt they could walk away from the table with enough to sell to their community, and nationalists felt exactly the same. The problem is there's a great article that talks about if you humiliate a person, you're going to get a reaction. And the problem is politics now, I think, in the States and in the Irish-British context and the Israeli-Palestinian context, it's about humiliating another person. I mean, I don't want to humiliate any person. I want every person I know to fulfill their potential. How do we achieve that politically is not an easy question.
Are you unsettled by the political discourse here in the United States and in other regions around the world? Yeah.
I mean, the phrase I used earlier was that phrase, linguistic violence. Just this ability to verbally assassinate the other person. And it's interesting, I mean, I'm doing work with both Republicans and Democrats in the United States, bringing them together for conversation. I mean, I was in Atlanta there over the summer, and I mean, it was a webinar like with 1,600 people signed up for that, and it was both conservatives and liberals in conversation together. I mean, both academics, universities in the US, religious bodies and politicians need to sit down and engage at a much better level. It was interesting, I did this thing in North Georgia for about 150 clergy, and people were actually frightened. I just mean frightened, really terrified. Said, Gary, I couldn't mention Clinton, I couldn't mention Trump, I couldn't mention Biden in the pulpit. What do I do? And I must say, I did take a couple of weeks to think about it, and so I did this experiment in a church in Georgia in March this year. And I knew in that church building, we were talking about peace building, reconciliation, conflict transformation, and I knew there were both Republicans and Democrats there. So for me to trash Donald Trump or trash Joe Biden or trash Clinton or Obama just wasn't going to work. So what I tried to do was create this kind of moral framework. So I asked this, 150 people, I says, tell me this, has any person here had a relative that fought in the Second World War? And I knew there were, so lots of hands went up across this auditorium. And I says, let me tell you about my relative that fought in the Second World War. He's my Uncle Jimmy. He's dead. I did his funeral. He was rescued at Dunkirk when the Nazis pushed the British forces into the English Channel. And I said, he was in the second day of D-Day. I says, he may actually have fought alongside some of your relatives. And I said, I'm not going to get into an argument about just war theories, but one theologian did say the only just war of the 20th century was the Second World War. some of the others we could go, well, should that have really happened? And I said I was very proud of him. He taught me to swim as a little boy, etc., etc. I said, I'm not here tonight. I don't live here, so I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat. But I want to talk about January the 6th. So you can see all their bottoms getting a bit edgy in the seats. What is he going to say in relation to this? And I said, can I say here tonight, if you're a Republican, you have a right to peaceful protest. In a democracy, that's a given. But I said, I struggled when I saw a gallows outside the seat of the largest democracy in the world. I also struggled when I saw someone running about with a t-shirt that said Camp Auschwitz on it. I said I further struggled when I saw a t-shirt that said 6MNWE. So no one knew what that was. I said, let me tell you what it meant. 6 million Jews were not enough. I said, see all your relatives you put your hands up for, who fought in the Second World War, along with my Uncle Jimmy. I can tell you this, and I'm damn sure this is right. None of them, not one of them, shed their blood in France or Normandy or come back to the United States to have people running outside your country crying for another Holocaust. The reason why your relatives fought was to stop the Holocaust. And it's interesting at the end of the night, this large American called Bill, who's a Republican. He came up to me, gave me a bear hug. I'm glad he only did it for 10 seconds. He'd probably crushed my ribs. He was a big, big guy. And he said, you know, Gary, I never thought of it like that. And I said, Bill, I respect you as a Republican. I respect you as a person of faith, as I respect other Democrats here as a person of faith. But you cannot have people asking for another Holocaust after what America and many other countries across this world did to destroy Nazism. So I was trying to create a moral framework, because I think if you personalise it, like verbally assassinate the Trumps, the Bidens, the Obamas, the Clintons, it gets people's hackles up. So I was trying to create a space where people could say, you know, maybe we do need to criticise some of the things. And that goes for Democrats as well. They're not clean either. You know, there's nobody who has a total monopoly in this, but people need to look at this, I think, in more detail.
Is there something to, you mentioned it before that, you know, the road that America can be on is not going to be Lee versus Grant at the Battle of Vicksburg. It'll be between kitchen tables and homes. Is there?
Yeah.
Can you talk for a second about that?
Yeah. As I look at the US at the moment, I mean, and America's like my second home. I mean, I've had thousands of Americans, I have associate pastors work with me who are Americans, etc., etc. And I'm concerned about it in a genuine way, not in any vicious way or one-upmanship or anything like that. And if a civil war breaks out in America, I mean, let me say, this is not Iraq, Vietnam, Afghanistan, something that happens 5,000 miles away. This is up close and personal. And it's also not like your Civil War, which was North versus South. When I was doing this conversation in Atlanta a few months ago, I said, this is like someone in Ponce de Leon, which is a big arterial route right through Atlanta, killing someone in North Decatur Road. This is neighbour killing neighbour. So this is like Belfast or Derry. So you're going to end up with a series of mini Belfasts or mini Derrys all over the United States. And that's why in our space it's so difficult to continue to rebuild our peace process, successful as it has been. Because you could be in a supermarket or a grocery store and see someone had killed your brother. You can't just draw a line under that overnight. And I mean, I think one of the miracles of the Irish peace process has been, and I've said this publicly, that we haven't had many revenge killings, if any. By and large, we've kind of moved on, even though we haven't got the architecture. So the concern, as I look as a strong friend of the United States, looking from the outside in the United States, this civil war, God forbid if it ever happened, could ruin your country for centuries, because it's neighbour killing neighbour. This is not bodies coming back from Iraq or Afghanistan. This is up close and personal. This is someone your son may have gone to university with, wants to kill him. So for that reason, continue your political debates, but stop verbally assassinating the other person, because as I quoted earlier, dehumanisation precedes genocide.
I have a couple of religious questions, if you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
What role has religion played both like in the conflict but also in the process of healing?
Yeah.
And is there a role for religion in this, or what is the role of religion in a modern, isolated, disconnected world through social media that we're living in? So it's a three-parter, but
Yeah. I think as a religious leader, I'm happy enough to critique religion as well as honour religion. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, quoting another theologian, religion is done wrong. Religion has led to pogroms, inquisitions, penal laws. So people have hated in the name of the God of love. They've practiced cruelty in the name of the God of compassion. They've waged war in the name of the God of peace. And they've killed in the name of the God of life. And I think one of the reasons for that is, as one person has highlighted, religion is power. And whatever is power can be used, misused, and abused. That goes for religion, it goes for the military, it goes for politics. So religious actors should never be abusing power, they should be using it for what is good. I often say to people, this was not a religious war in the sense that we were not fighting over doctrinal issues of the Reformation, Protestant Reformation, and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So we're not fighting over transubstantiation or salvation by faith, but I would still argue that a teaching of contempt about the other spilled into this space. And people grew up in two different tribes. Even you think of the Ulster Volunteer Force, which were protagonists on the Loyalist Unionist side, non-state actors. Their motto is, for God in Ulster. Look to 1916, the Easter Rising. Almost, and Catholic theologians have critiqued this better than I have, where they've said that they were linking a rebellion with Jesus' resurrection, which meant victory. So, while it was never a religious war, people have used religious motifs to justify their actions. So I do this lecture in the States called With God on Our Side. So who's God on the side of the Republicans or the Democrats? Whose side is God on? And I want to argue that God, actually, shocker as this may come, God doesn't have a nationality. Definitely has got an Irish passport, British, American, Israeli, Palestinian. And the thing for me theologically, I often say is, my problem is the imprint of God is in every person. So that image of God is in every single human being. So I have no right to disrespect another person. I will call out wrong where I see it, but I can't be going about verbally assassinating another person because they don't necessarily see things through my world lens. The problem is religion has done that. It also has to be said that in this conflict, religious actors did play a key role. There's probably 1,200 clergy in the Isle of Ireland, maybe not as many now, but a group of probably about 15 to 20 were involved in what I would sort of call hardcore peace building. Many others were involved in more softer peace building, worship services, St Anne's Cathedral, St Peter's Cathedral, bringing people together for worship and for friendship. But there were a small group were involved in really negotiating with those who were pursuing political violence, trying to create alternatives. And it was not an overnight phenomenon or success. There were many dark, difficult days wondering, would we actually get through this? But I just think it's so important for religious actors, and I think in the United States as well, for those who are involved in militia groups, religious actors need to be asking people like that, where did you get your narrative from? So if I was living in a town in North Georgia, and let's call, say, Bob was the main militia guy in that town, I'd be saying, Bob, tell me your story. You weren't born with this worldview. What shaped you as a person? Grandparents? Friends? How did that come about? So again, it's the danger of the single narrative. So how do we create another narrative to humanise the other person, and how does that look? And I think that helped here considerably. I spent my life in this Irish context. I chair a kind of island-wide group of about 60, 70 people called Compass Points. We function under Chatham House rules, but it creates a space for people who 25, 30 years ago were wanting to kill each other. Now, constitutionally they may be different, but they no longer want to kill each other. And I kind of look at the US and I often say that you need to create those spaces as well.
Is there anything that haunts you from the conflict?
Yeah, people kind of, I suppose, often ask, why do you do this? I suppose I do it because it's the right thing to do. But I look back to some of my childhood friends. So, I went to an all-boys school, and when I look at the photograph now, I can pick out 5 or 6 are dead because of this space. I'm not, thankfully. But maybe there's a kind of, maybe I'm paying back something, realising I could have made a choice. in relation to that as well. You know, I mean, I remember like one night as a young boy, people going to join a paramilitary organisation, and I just went on my way to do something else. I remember telling that story to a guy from Derry, a Catholic guy, nationalist guy, said, you know, Gary, same thing happened to me. He says, I was going to join the IRA, but I went to the wrong door. And then I woke up the next day and said, well, flip, this is maybe not a good idea. You know, and the two of us said, like, how our lives could have been so different. That's not justifying what people did. But the biggest issue in this space, I think, for many people that got involved in the conflict, and were involved in some horrendous things, which as a clergy person, religious leader, I condemn. But what shaped their narrative? What made them so toxic against another person? Because as I often say, those 30,000 people that were released from prison, they did a lot of wrong. But if they had been born in New York, Atlanta, Rio de Janeiro, Berlin, the vast majority of them never would have been in prison. Now about 10%, sort of criminologists and sociologists would say, were probably just natural born psychopaths. So there's 90%. And the vast majority of them, since they've been out of prison, have never reoffended. I think it's 3% of those 30,000 people have reoffended. So they weren't natural born killers, but there was a context here, which I condemn what they did. I have to say that. I don't want people thinking, oh, I'm kind of, and I've had this debate with many of them on both sides, that I understand why they did it, while disagreeing with what they did.
Were you ever afraid of, like, what has religion been able to, your religious faith, allowed you to go into some pretty hairy spots? I mean, is there something that you can speak to them?
I suppose theologically there, I guess, within sort of Methodism, I mean, all traditions have their quirky bits of theology. Methodism sort of has this two-track approach. It talks about personal holiness and social holiness. So social holiness, I suppose, put it in a more kind of blunt way, means allowing your faith to spill into the public space. So I'd want to argue strongly for any person of any religious persuasion listening into this, that faith does not belong in what I call the fusty, musty, dusty, rarefied atmosphere of church. I mean, as I look at my tradition, because of the people, I guess, in the Jewish tradition and Islamic tradition and other traditions listening into this, I think faith has to move out of our closet and make a difference in society. And that's why I talked about that political peace process versus social peace process. So even people with no faith, so I mean, if I work closely with people who don't believe in God, yes, I might call it grace. They may say, well, Gary, it's generosity to me. So I will say, let's not get hung up on the words. Let's try to make a difference in the public square.
What work still needs to be done here in this community?
Yeah. Academics and experts on peace processes say normally it takes 50 years to bed down a peace process. We're halfway through at 25 years. We still have our bumps, but so the life my kids have now is not the life I had in the 70s. You went home from your work or from your school and you stayed in your designated space. And I suppose now I know many on both sides who will be nameless, who were senior IRA figures, senior UVF figures. Their kids have now fallen in love with the other. So maybe romance is the answer in relation to some of these problems.
I think we will end on that note.
Isn't it like you know, like I